every war brings its lessons, some bitter, some of vindication. So while a war is going on in Ukraine, in fact, I don't even like to call it Ukraine-Russia war anymore. This is the Russian invasion of Ukraine. That's also been throwing up many lessons. These are diplomatic, geopolitical, political, moral, cultural, and we've been focusing on many of these in various episodes of Cut the Clutter. However, this time, in this episode, we are only focusing on the military aspect, and there too specifically on one thing, one instrument of war, which is the tank, or what is called generally the main battle tank. Now, a tank has been the king of battle, particularly in the plains, where you can put out large bodies of armor. So just the vision of large bodies of armor coming at you, tanks coming at you, and modern tanks can drive at 60, 65 kilometers an hour, right? It's quite fast for a 50 ton, 60 ton, 65 ton machine coming at you with all kinds of weapons, because tanks have their main gun, their machine gun, they have anti-tank missiles, they can have surface to air missiles, they can have anti-aircraft cannon also added. So tanks are very potent weapons. And most modern armies, particularly large armies, rely on tanks to bring about the denouement they want in a battle. Now, what this war has shown so far, this war has shown the weaknesses that tanks have developed in the modern battlefield. And we've talked about some of those. We've said that today, with more precision guided missiles, more accurate missiles, lighter missiles, drones, the cost of defense has become much cheaper and capital assets have become a liability. But more importantly, if you get into more nuanced aspects, say of the tanks in this case, it is now evident that Russian tanks have some kind of a design flaw. Let me tell you something. I have seen destroyed tanks, right? I wasn't there in 1965 or 71 covering the wars. I was too young then. But I've seen those tanks destroyed in those wars, kept as trophies in India at our cantonments and other places, and in Pakistan as well. Now, after that, I've seen destroyed tanks elsewhere. I've seen tanks destroyed in the Gulf War, the first Gulf War. These were Saddam Hussein's tanks, hundreds of which were destroyed. And as you drove across the country, this was flat ground, classical tank terrain. And we saw a lot of those destroyed there also. Those were also of Russian or at that point Soviet origin. So they were destroyed. But you also said, all right, American air power, total air superiority, and generally the American tech superiority, those tanks had no chance. But a lot of tanks were destroyed. Not just that, I've also seen personally a lot of tanks that were destroyed in the 1973 Yom Kippur War between Israel and Egypt. Now, once again, I wasn't there when the war took place. I was just 16 at that point. But in 1991, while covering the first Gulf War, I did rent a car from Jerusalem, drove past Eilat, and right across the Sinai Desert into Cairo after crossing the Suez Canal. Now, all across Sinai Desert, there are still wrecks and hulls of tanks destroyed in 1973 lying. So the pictures we might have taken, say in the Sinai Desert, they are lying in India Today's archive someplace, but I have this one from Kuwait. This is a destroyed Iraqi tank in the 91 war. Obviously, Kabadis have not discovered that area, or maybe in that part of the world, Kabadis are not so smart as maybe the Indian Kabadis would be. So those tanks are lying there. So we stopped the car, we got into many of them, you can walk inside them, you can even find the odd badge or a belt or something lying there. And if you want to be cheap, you can pick one up. I didn't. So those tanks. Now, if you see these destroyed tanks from all sides, from both sides, Indian, Pakistani, Arab, Israeli, Saddam Hussein's tanks, that is Iraq's tanks. I've never seen tanks destroyed as comprehensively as the pictures now coming out of the war in Ukraine show us. Now, all the tanks that we've seen destroyed, and thousands of tanks have been destroyed in warfare, and we've seen many in many wars, as I just told you. We've never seen tanks destroyed in the manner they are now being They are now being taken apart in the Ukrainian battlefield. So what's happening is you see picture after picture after picture, and some will run on my screen as I'm talking. You see picture after picture after picture of tanks literally cut into two. It's as if they've been sliced horizontally. So what's happening is the hull, the entire hull, the gun, it's getting separated from the tank and jumping up. In some cases, in one case, see this picture and this tweet, in this case, landing on the fifth floor of an apartment building. And this happened in Mariupol. Then again you see in Chernihiv, this tank turret landing on top of the second floor of a rural house, a two-story rural house. Now how heavy is a tank turret? A T-72 tank generally is about between 42 to 45 tons. So you would imagine that the tank turret would be several tons. I can't tell you precisely, but my guess would be about 7 to 8 tons. So an object 7 to 8 tons heavy, or maybe even more, gets blown up so comprehensively that it breaks away from the main body, that's the hull of the tank, and goes up and lands someplace else. When that happens, you can imagine what's happening to the crew inside. A T-72 has a crew of about 3. Now there's a lot of discussion. There's a lot of discussion coming up on sort of military websites and open source intelligence platforms asking a question. Is there a design flaw in Russian tanks? And it's very important for us in India to think about it. And I will tell you why. Because most of our tanks, we have an inventory of nearly 5,000 tanks. Most of them, say about 95% of them, are Russian origin, some even Soviet origin tanks. In fact, a lot of them are also built in India, but from kits and design, etc., which have come from Russia or the Soviet Union before that. So bulk of our tanks are T-72s. Then we have some newer T-90s. If you saw those Indian tanks ranged against Chinese tanks, say in the Chushul area or the Kailash ranges area, most of those were T-90 tanks. Those are the latest Russian tanks. So most of India's tank force is Russian origin tank force. Now, okay, we should not get too anxious for the simple reason that most of China's tank force is also Russian origin tank force. It's just that the Chinese have made copies of Russian weapon systems, Russian tanks, as the Chinese always do. Similarly, we can also be comforted by the fact that most of the tanks that the Pakistanis own are Chinese tanks, either built by China or put together by them on Chinese designs with Chinese kits. So in any case, whatever flaws, design flaws, these tanks have, tanks owned by A have, the same design flaws you would presume tanks owned by B and tanks owned by C also have. So, but that is not the reason why we should not learn the lesson. Because right now, India is not operating in a very highly sort of missile heavy environment. But we don't know what tomorrow's warfare will be. Now see what's happening with these tanks and what could be a design flaw. So I'm sharing with you a story on CNN. You will see a screenshot on my screen and I'll share a link with you. And the CNN reporter has talked to many experts. And now, even if you Google and say design flaw Russian tanks, one expression will pop out at you almost as tellingly as those tank turrets going up in Ukraine. Now, this expression is Jack in the box. Jack in the box is when something is stuck inside a little box, there is a spring, you let the spring go and boom, what's inside goes up. So what they are saying is that Russian tanks, particularly T-72s and T-80s also, they store their ammunition, which could be anything from 20 to 40 shells, generally 20-22 shells for T-72s in the turret or under the turret. So what happens is any hit on a tank which affects this area or which hits this area gets this ammunition, these shells to explode. So that's like human beings choking in their own blood. It's like in a human being, if a big artery bursts, a dorsal aorta bursts, human being can drown in their own blood. So something like this happens. So as this ammunition blows up, it blows the turret out because the ammunition is sitting right under the turret. Now, this has happened because Russians are smart people. Russians were trying to make their tanks. Russians have great reliance on big armored thrusts. So they make very good tanks. So they try to make their tanks as light as possible, as small as possible, to have as little of a silhouette as possible. So that means that much tougher to target. And while doing that, they also traded space inside the tank for better silhouette and better technology. So what they did was they set up a system of auto-loading their ammunition. So auto-loading the ammunition means that standard crew of 4 in a tank is no longer needed. A crew of 3 will do the trick. But because of this auto loading, this ammunition, at least these 20 odd shells, are loaded under the turret. That is the jack in the box phenomenon. Because if this tank is hit by something, particularly if it's hit on the top, now see a lot of these missiles, javelins for example, NLAWs, they come from the top and they hit that cupola turret region. That is the reason you will find many Russian tanks which are going into battle. They have this crude contraption on top of the tank which looks like a bird nest. In fact, it's even called a bird nest. That is to deflect the javelin missile. But obviously this is not working because when missile gets a hit, then this ammunition under the turret blows up, and that's when the jack in the box boom goes up. And that is what now the whole world, the entire military community is studying. So obviously Russians will learn their lessons from it, and going ahead you will find changes happening. So if the Russian armed forces performance in Ukraine has been indifferent by their standards, they are a military superpower and they've been stalemated badly, suffering very high casualties and very high losses. Partly it's because their armor, their tanks have been found out by missiles, and because of this fatal flaw in their design, they are suffering heavy casualties. What kind of casualties? Now, there is an open source intelligence platform that we check out. For the simple reason, they keep an account, they keep an inventory of all equipment losses by both sides, that is the Russian side and the Ukrainian side. The important thing is they only list what they can establish by way of a picture or a video. So if you go to their Twitter handle or their website and you can see the entire inventory of losses, say Russian losses, you touch any equipment, it says T-72 on such and such date. If you touch that, that will throw up a picture or video of that tank or that armored personnel carrier or infantry fighting vehicle or even a truck or a technical as it's called or a command post. Now that listing shows with proof, with evidence that Russians have lost 671 tanks, 671, and this is updated only till 13th of May. So more time has passed since then and tanks are being lost every day. 671 tanks. How have these been lost? Thereby also hangs a story. So of the 671, 361 are destroyed, and you have the pictures and videos of each one. 361 out of 671 destroyed. What happened to the remaining 410? 21 are damaged. Fair enough, in warfare, tanks can get damaged. 21 are damaged, 48 are abandoned. That's an important number. And 239 are captured. So you would presume while some might have been captured with the crews surrendering, chances are that most tanks that got captured by the Ukrainians had been abandoned. Now, is this abandonment of tanks taking place because of this design flaw? That other crew have seen what happens to a tank when it gets hit. It just blows up because the ammunition under the turret blows up. So they lose heart, and when they see resistance, they tend to leave their tanks and scoot because, as we all know, jaan hai to jahan hai. So military community worldwide is now seized of this issue because a lot of armies in the world have Russian or Soviet origin tanks because these are cheap, sasta, sundar, tikau so far. But in this war, it looks like they are not so tikau anymore. Now, obviously, Russians will find a solution in the course of time. It's tough to do so with hardware in the middle of a war. I am sure in the course of time, other armies will also find their own missiles or find a way of acquiring those missiles or building those missiles, including India. I can guarantee that to you. But this debate will now go on. I read a lot of articles saying this is the end of the tank. The tank will cease to exist. No such thing happens. Every now and then, the end of something or some kind of equipment is announced. But that equipment then changes. It gets modified. Also, its role can change. The doctrine can be modified. So all those things will happen. But whatever happens going ahead to other aspects of military warfare, conventional warfare, the role of the tank, the design of the tank, how the tank is to be used in modern doctrines, all that will change as a result of this war. Now, I started out by saying that every war has its lessons and every war has military lessons particularly. And many of these lessons are nuanced because they are limited to certain equipments. And right now the focus is on Russian tanks, but it's not as if only equipment from one side, in this case the anti-NATO side or NATO's adversaries, is found to be defective. So I will conclude this with a story. I will take you back to the India-Pakistan War of 1965. In the 1965 war, Pakistani tanks had an enormous technological advantage over Indian tanks. They had more modern tanks, more tanks with bigger guns. Their Patton tank M48, various versions of M48 Patton, had at least a 90 gun, whereas India's best tank, the Centurion, mostly had 84 gun. In those days, tanks fought tanks directly. There was no such thing as beyond visual range, anything. Now, in that war, not only did the Pakistanis fail to exploit their superiority in their better tanks, Patton tanks, they actually lost a lot and they abandoned a lot. Now, the important thing was, why were they abandoning these tanks? Even if you see the Battle of Asal Uttar in Khimkaran, which was seen to be the destruction and defeat of Pakistan's wanted, the pride of Pakistan, the one armored division. Even there, 75 tanks were left. Many of them destroyed or damaged, and many just abandoned. And if you want to read more detail of that, I would say find somewhere a copy of War Dispatches, Indo-Pak Conflict 1965 by Lieutenant General Harbaksh Singh. Lieutenant General Harbaksh Singh was commanding Indian Army in the western sector. Western and northern sector were won in 1965. And he gives us the details of these battles. And this is a very candid account because he's telling us a lot about what went wrong on our side. Now, after the war, the Americans also got worried that why did the M48 Patton tank do so badly? So what did they do? They assigned a think tank which used to do a lot of contract work for the Pentagon, then called HERO, that is Historical and Economic Research Organization, founded by a man called Colonel Trevor Dupuy. And they were to research all tank battles in the century, including the 1965 India-Pakistan War, with special emphasis on the question that why did the Pattons do so badly? The Pattons could fight at night. Indian tanks could not fight at night because the Pattons had infrared sights. No Indian tank had any infrared sights. And yet, the Pakistanis, very well trained to what would today be called NATO standards, and Pakistanis make very good soldiers. Pakistani army is very effective, very efficient, very professional. So why did they abandon these tanks? That became a question. Now, HERO produced a report, and I'm sharing a screenshot with you, and I'm also sharing a link with you from archives. This report, if you find, it will tell you that the Indo-Pak War of 1965 is in a classified annexure. So what was classified then has remained classified. But we know that one big change came about in Patton tanks after that war. Until that war, the existing versions of Patton tanks had gasoline or petrol engines. Then a big radical change came about, and the new versions or new models of Patton tanks came with diesel engines. So why did these petrol tanks get dieselized? It's not as if Americans also subsidized their diesel as we used to do, so people bought diesel cars in place of petrol cars. No. What Colonel Dupuy's team discovered was that when some of these tanks got hit, because they had petrol inside them, fuel inside them, they caught fire immediately. And a fear spread amongst Pakistani troops that if you get hit, you will die by fire. This was 1965, right? This was almost 60 years back. And this feeling that if I burn by fire, if I die by fire, I will go to hell. So that fear of burning to death drove many of them to abandon their tanks and run to save their lives. That's what led the Americans or the manufacturers, I think it was Chrysler, to change the basic fuel of the tank. So it was because of 1965 war that the new Patton tanks came with diesel engine instead of the petrol one. So I'm quite sure after this war, whenever it's over, even the Russian origin tanks will go through major design changes. Just as I am sure much equipment on the other side also, learning from the war, will go through many changes. So if Colonel Dupuis group kept this report classified, how do we know about this? So 1987, I spent some time in Washington working with Steve Cohen, Professor Steve Cohen, and he mentioned some of this to me. And he said, why don't you go to this organization, Hero, for a story? So I did go there and I did speak with them. And because sufficient time had by now passed, people there did talk about this and confirmed it. And this was then reported in a story that I did for India Today magazine.